Video games have come a long way in the past 40 years. Once limited to a small handful of pixels and an even smaller palette of colors, games today like Red Dead Redemption 2 and Marvel's Spider-Man can immerse us in beautiful, lush, expansive worlds that, under the right conditions, can look nearly indistinguishable from reality. As games strive to be more and more realistic, however, I find myself growing less interested, turning instead toward games with more unique, creative, often retro-inspired art styles. It feels to me that there's something older games had that modern AAA games simply can't recapture. The video game industry has a unique obsession with graphical realism that's not nearly as common in other artistic mediums. AAA publishers, and by extension their player bases, value graphical fidelity over every other aspect of a game, scrutinizing trailers frame by frame and complaining when released games are downgraded from their preview counterparts. AAA game budgets have ballooned massively in the past 2 decades, thanks in no small part to this emphasis on cutting-edge graphics and realism, now costing as much or more than even the highest-budget blockbuster films. These are the games that dominate the gaming news cycle and the core quote-unquote gamer discourse online. Despite this, though, it's fairly rare for me to be drawn into one of these games in the same way that I was, say, Breath of the Wild a few years ago. At the end of the day, I can't help but feel like there's something missing in this that can be found in this. If you follow the online game dev space at all, you'll know that there's a bit of an early 3D renaissance happening right now, with hobbyist developers from all over the world experimenting with the graphical styles of the N64 and original PlayStation, both to demake modern games like in the case of Bloodborne PSX, or to make something original like Legend 64, which is actually what inspired me to make this video. Much has been written and many videos made about the uncanny, almost eerie atmosphere of many early 3D games, with their angular environments, low-resolution, blurry yet weirdly realistic textures, and heavy use of fog to hide low draw distances. The levels fall perfectly into descriptors like liminal space, representing spaces just well enough to give you the sense that there's something important missing. The walls feeling almost like a facade, deliberately obscuring your view of something more sinister. The N64 and PS1 developers were well aware of this fact too, using it to craft much darker and more ominous experiences than were possible on older hardware. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask is the most famous example of this, the whole game awash with overtones of utter despair and decay. Even more so than pixel art, I think, the early 3D style has a dreamlike quality, verging almost on nightmarish. Dreams of getting lost in the woods, secret passages to alternate worlds, being alone, stranded, enclosing claustrophobic darkness and the cries of nocturnal terrors. It perfectly embodies the spirit of campfire horror stories, which I guess might now include creepypastas. Stories you know aren't real, but you'll still think twice before fully shutting your eyes at night. It's an art style I really hope grows in popularity. I can't wait to see how it expands beyond its original limitations. For now though, I'm greatly enjoying the demakes and faithful recreations. Let's talk a little more about pixel art. Pixel art is my personal favorite art style. Something about the fixed level of detail and the limitations it imposes makes for an incredibly charming, very impressionistic look that feels extremely special. It works well to capture not just the essence of a space, but also the emotions and overall vibe in a way I think is immensely hard, maybe even impossible sometimes, to do with a more realistic art style. I truly feel that pixel art belongs in the history books alongside the works of Da Vinci and Van Gogh. It's that powerful. The added beauty of pixel art in 2022 is its maturity as a style. It can be used to faithfully recreate 8 and 16-bit era games like in Shovel Knight, for example, but it's also been used to even greater impact, in my opinion, to give an intimate touch to otherwise modern, technical games like Minecraft. Or together with post-processing techniques like bloom and chromatic aberration, to create entirely new styles like the ones seen in Eastward and Loop Hero. Pixel art can have incredibly detailed shading and animation, but it can also work in more flat, simplistic styles. It's super versatile. Both early 3D and pixel art work so well because they force your mind to fill in the gaps with your own imagination. Each player comes away with a slightly different, yet much more intimate, personal experience of the game. It's a lot like reading a book or viewing a painting in that way. You feel like you're inside the mind of the artist, even if, in reality, you're inside your own. This is the reason I think that realistic games really struggle to capture me in the same way. You can't fill in the gaps when the style necessitates as few gaps as possible. Realism also invites scrutiny. As soon as something not realistic happens, it's immediately drawn to your attention, like odd NPC behavior or a ragdoll glitching out on the ground. It instantly stands out as being wrong, and I think this is partially why there's such a strong culture of dissecting games and their graphics online. It's kind of an unavoidable side effect. Revived retro aesthetics aren't realism's only competition though, as there are tons of other unique art styles that have seen explosive growth in the past few years. In my opinion, there are 3 main categories: toon shading, hand-drawn 2D, and a kind of Pixar-esque vanilla 3D style. Toon shading was first seen in games with the release of Jet Set Radio, but was really popularized by The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, and a much grittier comic book style take in the Borderlands series. Toon shading, also known as cell shading, is a simplistic 3D art style, usually featuring just 1 or 2 tones for each color to indicate the direction of lighting, and sometimes outlines. It's based on the simplistic flat shading of classic cartoons and comic books, hence the name. Aside from the 3 games I already mentioned, my personal favorite implementation is found in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The Breath of the Wild art style is one that I'd consider incredibly refined. The character models are detailed, yet slightly obscured by the shading, with the detail only being revealed at edges or under certain lighting conditions. There's also a subtle edge light, or Fresnel, that helps the characters stand out from the environment. It doesn't have that rounded, childlike quality from Wind Waker, but it's also clearly differentiating itself from realism, and from the look of previous Zelda games. It's meeting somewhere in the middle, evoking aesthetics of anime and classical hand-drawn animation, utilizing the rules and techniques of its art style. It's an utterly unique style, and I think it's really cool. As for hand-drawn 2D, it's a style that's grown extremely popular in the indie game space, featured in wildly successful games like Hollow Knight, Hades, Slay the Spire, Don't Starve, and many, many others. Most recently, it was Cult of the Lamb. From a development standpoint, it's probably the most versatile art style there is. All you need is someone who can draw. Depending on the color palette, line style, shape language, frame rate, and a bunch of other factors, hand-drawn art can convey tons of different atmospheres and moods, from the goofy chaos of Plants vs. Zombies to the stunningly beautiful watercolored world of Gris. My friends and I even used it in our own game, Cataclysm, that we made for a game jam. Finally, there's the vanilla 3D look, which can range wildly from the simplicity of something like Fall Guys all the way to the Pixar-level polish of Super Mario Odyssey, Overwatch, and Kena Bridge of Spirits. One thing remains consistent though: the use of simple materials with realistic lighting. Much like the hand-drawn style, it's incredibly easy to implement from a development side, as most public game engines are already set up with default shaders that have realistic lighting models. It allows designers to focus more on things like lighting and composition without having to worry about breaking the art style. Like its filmic counterpart though, this style is probably the most overused one, mostly due to its default nature. Like I said, it's possible to be done really well. Tunic, one of my favorite games of the past few years, uses it. However, Tunic is unique in a lot of ways, and I don't think that the overworld art style was the most important part of that. I think that in general, unless executed perfectly, games that use this style are successful in spite of it rather than because of it. Art style is probably the most important thing for me when looking for new games, and together with music, greatly impacts the tone, atmosphere, and overall experience of a game. Many gamers, and really people in general, especially those who aren't as in touch with their creative side, seem to be under the false notion that the goal of art is to be as realistic as possible, to eventually reach a point where art is indistinguishable from reality. For me, though, the opposite couldn't be more true. Art is inherently subjective, impressionistic, not real. So why not lean into that? I often find myself drawn toward animated films rather than live action, and it's no coincidence that Arcane and the final season of Star Wars: The Clone Wars were some of my favorite TV shows of the past few years. That's not to say that graphical realism has no place. Blade Runner 2049 was one of my favorite in-theater experiences. And sometimes, you just want to swing around New York City as Spider-Man. Like with other mediums though, I find that leaning into stylization and the subjective in video games is extremely effective. To tie it back to my last video for a moment, it's part of the reason why the old Pokemon games worked and the new ones don't. The pixel art aesthetic deepens your connection to the game. There are certain feelings that can't be captured as effectively using a realistic style, and I think it's limiting the types of stories that AAA video games can tell. Having said that, art style is also not the be-all and end-all of games. Video games are massive, complex pieces of software with tons of moving parts. Different systems that all work together to give players the experience of existing in another world. There are definitely additional reasons behind the homogenization of AAA games. I do think, though, that the pursuit of realism, often at the cost of other aspects of a game, is a driving force behind big studios' decisions. Riding my horse across the open plains of the American West in Red Dead Redemption 2 is certainly an experience. A surreal one, almost. The level of visual fidelity is stunning and would have been simply unimaginable only 10 years ago. What it's not, though, is an emotional experience, at least not for me. I can appreciate what I'm seeing on a technical level, but it doesn't grab me in the same way Kokiri Forest does in Ocarina of Time. And that experience of having a work of art jump off the page, so to speak, and immediately evoke an emotional response simply from how it looks, is something I think is underutilized and underappreciated in games. Thanks for watching.